The courtroom fell silent the moment the old man reached into the worn leather satchel at his feet. 81-year-old Walter Higgins had said almost nothing during the entire hearing. He had sat quietly at the defendant's table, his weathered hands folded in his lap. While his neighbor's lawyer spent the better part of an hour explaining to the judge why the creek that ran along the eastern edge of Walter's property, the creek his family had used for 3 generations, legally belonged to someone else. The neighbor, a wealthy real estate developer named Roland Cassidy, sat with his arms crossed and a small, confident smile on his face. His attorney had just finished telling the court that Cassidy had openly and continuously used the creek and the land surrounding it for over 30 years, and that under the legal doctrine of adverse possession, the law was now on his side. Cassidy wanted the creek. He wanted the water rights, and most importantly, he wanted the 11 acres of prime creekside land that separated his property from Walter's land he intended to develop into luxury lakefront cabins. The judge turned to Walter's table. "Mr. Higgins, does the defense have anything to present?" Walter's young attorney, a small-town lawyer named Denise Acre, who had taken the case almost as a favor to a man she'd known her whole life, glanced nervously at her client. She had warned him. Adverse possession cases were notoriously difficult to fight, especially when the opposing side had 3 decades of witnesses, tax records, and photographs to draw from. She had told Walter gently that they might lose the creek. But Walter had only smiled at her the way a man smiles when he knows something no one else in the room knows yet. "Actually, Your Honor," Walter said, rising slowly from his chair, his knees cracking audibly in the quiet courtroom, "I do have something." He bent down, unlatched the old satchel, and pulled out a yellowed, brittle document sealed in a plastic sleeve. The paper was so old it had begun to turn the color of weak tea, its edges soft and frayed from decades of handling. A raised county seal was still faintly visible in the corner, along with a surveyor's stamp and a date that made even the judge lean forward in her seat. "This is the original boundary survey of my family's property," Walter said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Conducted and filed with the county recorder's office in the spring of 1947. It was done the year my father bought this land from a man named Elmer Trout, and it has been sitting in my safe untouched for nearly 8 decades. Cassidy's smile vanished. "This document doesn't just show where the property line is," Walter continued. "It shows something else, something Mr. Cassidy's lawyer conveniently left out of his 30-year story." The courtroom, which moments earlier had felt like a formality on its way to becoming a loss for the old farmer, suddenly felt like the opening scene of something much bigger. To understand exactly what was inside that survey, and why it would turn Roland Cassidy's confident smile into something closer to panic, you have to go back. Back past the lawsuit, past the angry phone calls, past the fences that went up overnight and the trucks that blocked the road. You have to go all the way back to 1947, to a struggling young farmer named Elias Higgins, and a creek that would end up meaning more to 2 families than either of them ever expected. In the spring of 1947, the country was still finding its footing after the war. Soldiers were coming home, families were rebuilding, and in a quiet farming valley in the Midwest, a 26-year-old veteran named Elias Higgins was looking for a piece of land he could finally call his own. Elias had grown up poor, the son of sharecroppers who had never owned a single acre in their lives. He had spent 4 years overseas, and when he came home, he had one goal: to buy land, real land with his name on the deed that no landlord could ever take from him. He found it in a modest 140-acre parcel owned by an aging farmer named Elmer Trout, who was ready to retire and move in with his daughter in the city. The land wasn't much to look at, rocky in places, with a stubborn clay soil that made corn farming difficult, but it had one feature that made Elias fall in love with it instantly: a wide, clear spring-fed creek that cut diagonally across the eastern edge of the property. Tumbling gently over smooth stones before disappearing into a stand of old oak trees, Elmer Trout warned him about the creek before the sale even closed. "That water's a blessing and a curse," the old man told him, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse with a cup of black coffee in his hand. "Blessing, because it never runs dry even in the worst summers. Curse, because the fella who owns the land next door has been eyeing it for years. Name's Cassidy, big family, lots of cattle, and they don't have near enough water on their own side." Elias didn't think much of the warning at the time. He was young, proud, and eager to start his new life. But Elmer Trout, ever the cautious man, insisted on one condition before signing over the deed: that a proper, county-certified boundary survey be conducted first, to make absolutely clear where the property lines fell, especially around the creek. "I've seen good neighbors turn into enemies over a lot less than water rights," Elmer said. "I want it on paper, official, filed with the county, so there's never a question." And so in April of 1947, a licensed surveyor named Harold Bittman was hired to walk the entire boundary of the property with a transit and a chain, driving iron pins into the earth at every corner and mapping the full course of the creek as it wound through the land. It took nearly 3 weeks. When it was finished, Bittman drew up a detailed plat map, had it notarized, and filed the original with the county recorder's office. Elias Higgins was given a certified copy, which he folded carefully and placed inside a small fireproof safe he kept in his bedroom closet. A habit he had picked up in the army, where he'd learned that important papers had a way of disappearing when you least expected it. That certified copy would sit inside that safe, mostly forgotten, for the next 79 years. For the first few decades, the arrangement between the Higgins family and the Cassidys next door was, if not warm, at least peaceful. Elias married a local schoolteacher named Mabel, and together they raised 3 children on the farm. His neighbor to the east, a rancher named Buck Cassidy, ran cattle on his land and occasionally asked permission to water his herd at the creek during dry spells. Elias always said yes. It cost him nothing, and in a farming community you helped your neighbor when you could, because someday you might need the same kindness in return. There was an unspoken understanding between the two families. The creek belonged to the Higgins land, full stop, as the 1947 survey plainly showed, but the Cassidys were welcome to use it for their cattle as a neighborly courtesy. It was never a legal right. It was a favor extended year after year, decade after decade, without a single document ever being signed to change that fact. Buck Cassidy passed the ranch down to his son, Roland's father, in the early 1980s. By then, the cattle operation had shrunk considerably, and much of the Cassidy land had been sold off in parcels for development as the nearby town expanded. The unspoken agreement about the creek continued quietly, without incident, for another generation. Then in 2019, Roland Cassidy inherited what remained of his family's land. Roland was nothing like his father or grandfather. He had made his fortune in real estate development 2 states over, and had only moved back to take over the family property after a messy divorce left him looking for a fresh start and a new investment opportunity. He looked at the rolling hills, the mature trees, and most of all that clear spring-fed creek, and he didn't see a farm. He saw dollar signs. He envisioned a gated community of upscale cabins along the water, the kind of property that could sell for triple what raw farmland ever would. There was just one problem. The creek and the 11 acres surrounding it legally belonged to his elderly neighbor, Walter Higgins, Elias' son, who had taken over the farm decades earlier after his father passed away. At first, Roland tried the direct approach. In the fall of 2022, he knocked on Walter's door with a folder full of paperwork and a proposal. He wanted to buy the 11 acres surrounding the creek outright, offering what he called more than fair market value. Walter, then 78 years old and living alone since his wife's passing 5 years earlier, politely declined. The creek wasn't just water to him. It was where his father had taught him to fish. It was where he had proposed to his late wife, Carol, on a warm June evening in 1968. It was, in the simplest terms, home. Roland didn't take the rejection well. Over the following year, the tone between the two men shifted from cordial to icy. Roland began sending certified letters questioning the exact placement of the property line. He hired a private surveyor of his own, who, using modern GPS equipment but working from incomplete county records, produced a rough estimate suggesting the boundary might run somewhat differently than long assumed. It wasn't an official filed survey, but it was enough to give Roland's lawyers something to work with. Then, in early 2024, Roland made his move. He filed a civil suit against Walter Higgins, claiming a legal doctrine that many landowners have heard of but few truly understand: adverse possession. Adverse possession, broadly speaking, allows a person to claim legal ownership of land that isn't officially theirs if they can prove they have used it, openly, notoriously, exclusively, and continuously for a certain number of years. In this state, the threshold was 20 years. Roland's lawsuit argued that because Cassidy cattle had grazed near and watered at the creek for well over 30 years, and because a small footbridge his father had built decades earlier still crossed part of the disputed land, the Cassidy family had effectively possessed that section of the property long enough to claim legal ownership of it. It was an aggressive legal strategy and a clever one. Roland's lawyers had gathered decades of photographs showing Cassidy cattle at the creek, old ranch hands willing to testify that they had used the crossing for generations, and even utility records showing a small pump the Cassidys had installed near the water in the 1990s. What the lawsuit conveniently left out, or perhaps didn't even know about, was the single piece of paper that could unravel the entire case. The original, county-filed 1947 boundary survey sitting quietly in a fireproof safe in Walter Higgins's bedroom closet. For Walter, the lawsuit felt less like a legal dispute and more like a betrayal. He had grown up alongside Roland's father and uncle. He had extended kindness to that family for over 60 years, only to be repaid with a courtroom battle designed to strip away the land his own father had bled and sweated to buy. His children, now grown and living in other states, urged him to simply settle. "Dad, it's just land," his daughter told him over the phone one evening. "Take the money, you're 81. Do you really want to spend what could be your last good years fighting in court?" But Walter refused. It wasn't about the money, and it had never been about the cattle crossing or the footbridge. It was about the promise his father had made him swear as a young boy, sitting on that same porch where Elmer Trude had once warned Elias about the very same creek. Never let anyone take what's rightfully yours, and never sign away what your name is on. Walter hired Denise Acre, a local attorney who had grown up 2 farms over and had known the Higgins family her whole life. Denise was sharp, but she was honest with her client from the start. Adverse possession cases are an uphill battle, Walter, she told him during their first meeting. If Cassidy can show 30 years of open, continuous use, and you can't produce clear evidence disputing the boundary, a judge might rule in his favor, at least for the disputed strip near the creek. There's a survey, Walter said simply. Denise looked up from her notes. What survey? My father had one done back when he bought the place. 1947, it's in my safe. Denise felt a small flicker of hope, tempered immediately by professional caution. Walter, that's nearly 80 years old. Has it ever been recertified? Do you know if it even matches current county records? A lot can go wrong with documents that old, deterioration, outdated methods, even simple filing errors. I don't know, Walter admitted. I haven't looked at it in years. Truth be told, I forgot it was even in there until you started asking about the original boundary lines. That evening, for the first time in decades, Walter Higgins knelt down in front of the old fireproof safe in his bedroom closet, spun the worn dial through its combination from memory, and pulled out a small stack of documents his father had left him. Deeds, an old marriage certificate, a handful of black and white photographs, and near the bottom, a folded plastic sleeve containing a fragile yellowed piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully at the kitchen table under the glow of a single overhead light, and there it was. The surveyor's careful hand-drawn plat, the iron pin markers, the notary's stamp, and the county recorder's seal, dated April 14, 1947. And there, running diagonally across the eastern portion of the property in faded but unmistakable ink, was the creek, clearly, unambiguously placed well within the Higgins property line, with a margin of nearly 200 feet to spare on the Cassidy side. But that wasn't even the most important detail. As Walter traced his finger along the surveyor's handwritten notes in the margin, he found something that made his breath catch in his throat, something that would end up mattering far more than the boundary line itself. The following morning, Walter brought the document to Denise's office. She examined it under a magnifying lamp, her excitement growing with every passing minute. Walter, she said slowly, this isn't just a survey. Look at this notation here on the eastern boundary. Written in the surveyor's careful cursive alongside the official county seal was a clause that read, "Water rights to Cedar Hollow Creek, in its entirety as it traverses the herein described property, are reserved exclusively to the property owner and successors, notwithstanding any future grazing or crossing permissions extended to neighboring landholders." In other words, Harold Bittman, the original surveyor, had documented, in writing, on an official filed survey, the exact scenario that would unfold 77 years later. He had anticipated that neighboring ranchers might use the creek for their cattle, and he had explicitly noted that such use would never, under any circumstances, constitute a transfer of ownership or water rights. It was, in modern legal terms, an airtight preemptive defense against exactly the kind of adverse possession claim Roland Cassidy was now attempting to make. "This is extraordinary," Denise said, sitting back in her chair. "Most adverse possession defenses rely on proving the use wasn't actually continuous or wasn't truly exclusive. But this is a documented, notarized acknowledgement, filed with the county the same year the property was purchased, explicitly stating that any use by neighbors would remain a permission, not a right. It directly undermines the entire foundation of Cassidy's claim. There was still work to do." Denise needed to verify the document's authenticity with the county archives, confirm it matched the current recorded property lines, and prepare to have it formally entered into evidence. She spent the following weeks working with the county recorder's office, tracking down the original filed copy in a dusty archive room in the courthouse basement to confirm Walter's copy was genuine and unaltered. She also brought in a modern licensed surveyor to walk the property and confirm that, despite nearly 80 years of natural shifts in the creek's exact path, the original iron boundary pins, several of which remarkably were still in place, driven deep into the earth, matched the 1947 survey almost perfectly. Everything checked out. The document was real, the boundary was accurate, and the clause about water rights was unambiguous. By the time the case went to trial in the summer of 2025, both sides had built their arguments. Roland Cassidy's legal team presented what looked on the surface like a strong case. 30-plus years of photographs showing cattle at the creek, testimony from longtime ranch hands, records of the footbridge, and even utility documentation for the small water pump. What they didn't have, because they had never bothered to search the county's oldest archives, and because Walter had never mentioned it to anyone outside his immediate family, was any awareness that the original 1947 survey even existed, let alone that it contained an explicit clause addressing exactly this situation. When Walter stood up in that courtroom and pulled the survey from his satchel, the momentum of the entire case shifted in a matter of minutes. Denise Acre walked the judge through each element of the document. The county seal confirming its official filing, the matching iron boundary markers still found in the ground, nearly 80 years later. And finally, the surveyor's explicit clause reserving water rights to the Higgins property regardless of any future grazing permissions extended to neighbors. Roland's attorney tried to argue that the clause was vague, or that it couldn't have anticipated modern legal doctrines like adverse possession. But the judge, a careful and unhurried woman named Judge Patricia Renfro, was unmoved. "This document doesn't need to anticipate modern case law," she said, reviewing the survey herself. "It simply needs to establish the nature of the use in question, and it does so unambiguously." Any use of this creek by the Cassidy family, however long-standing, was explicitly documented as permissive, not adversarial, at the very moment the property changed hands in 1947. That fact alone defeats the exclusivity and hostility elements required for an adverse possession claim. The color drained from Roland Cassidy's face as the judge continued. Furthermore, Judge Renfro added, the court finds it noteworthy that the plaintiff's own surveyor's report, commissioned only last year, failed to consult the original county-filed boundary survey before initiating this claim, a survey that has been part of the public record for nearly 8 decades. This suggests, at minimum, an incomplete investigation prior to litigation. After a short recess, Judge Renfro returned with her decision. The court ruled decisively in favor of Walter Higgins, dismissing Roland Cassidy's adverse possession claim in its entirety. The boundary line, as established by the certified 1947 survey and confirmed by the modern surveyor's field verification, was upheld exactly as it had been drawn nearly 8 decades earlier. The creek, the 11 surrounding acres and full water rights remained, unequivocally, the property of Walter Higgins. The judge went a step further, noting that the permissive language in the original survey served as a valuable lesson for landowners and legal practitioners alike, documenting the nature of a neighborly favor, in writing, at the time it is extended, can prevent decades of future disputes. Outside the courthouse, reporters from the local paper caught up with Walter as he walked slowly down the steps, leaning slightly on a cane he rarely used except on long days. When asked how it felt to win, he simply said, "It's not really about winning. It's about keeping a promise. My father made sure this land would always belong to whoever tended it honestly. I just made sure that promise held." Roland Cassidy declined to comment as he left the courthouse, though sources close to the case later confirmed he chose not to appeal, likely recognizing that the documented evidence left little room for a different outcome. Walter Higgins passed away 18 months after the trial concluded, at the age of 83, in the same farmhouse his father had built decades earlier. In his will, he left the property to his 3 children with a single request: that the 11 acres surrounding Cedar Hollow Creek never be sold, developed, or divided, but instead preserved exactly as it had always been. His daughter, going through his belongings after the funeral, found the fireproof safe still sitting in the bedroom closet. Inside, alongside the family photographs and old letters, was the 1947 survey itself, carefully preserved in a new archival sleeve, with a handwritten note from Walter clipped to the front. The note read simply, "Some things are worth keeping, even when you think no one will ever need them again. Keep this safe, you never know who might come looking for the creek." To this day, the property remains in the Higgins family. The creek still running clear and cold through the eastern edge of the land, exactly where a young surveyor named Harold Bittman mapped it nearly 80 years ago. A quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't found in a modern courtroom filing, but in a single piece of paper carefully preserved waiting patiently in an old safe for the day it would finally be needed.